Hello my friends, welcome to my channel, Lindy's Magpie Reads, and it is Friday, so I'm going to do a Friday Reads talking about the books that I've finished lately. The most exciting thing that has happened in the past few days is two trips to the used bookstore downtown in Edmonton, the Wee Book Inn. I read so much that my house would be overrun if I didn't mostly read library books, and of the other books that I read that aren't library books, I mostly pass them along to a good home. But I was starting to get quite a pile, and so I brought a few to the Wee Book Inn to either trade in or get credit for, and I was happy to see a collection of poetry by Heid Erdrich, National Monuments. This person is the sister of Louise Erdrich, and when I talked about Louise Erdrich's Books and Islands in Ojibwe country a month or more ago, one of my subscribers, Debbie Baker, recommended that I read this poetry, and I'm very glad. I've read the first couple of poems, and yeah, they're good. They're good. And so this was on Wednesday. The other thing that happened was when I was at the counter getting this book, I saw behind the desk where they have the big expensive books, there was a copy of one that I've been wanting for a long time. Marija Gimbutas is the language of the goddess. I used to borrow this quite regularly from the library until the day that there was no longer any copy there. Either it fell apart or somebody stole it. I don't know what happened to it, but it was no longer in the library collection, and it was not in print. This was back in the 1990s, and at that time it wasn't so easy to look online and buy a used copy as it is now. But I just eventually forgot about it. But before I tell you how much it influenced me, I'll just tell you a little bit what it's about. Gimbutas was an archaeologist, a Lithuanian archaeologist, and this book is full of drawings of mostly pottery from Neolithic up into the Bronze Age. And I am just in love with these images. She has theories about matriarchal cultures that I don't necessarily subscribe to, but I love, love, love the images. So here's an example. I'm going to go up really close. Her description of this is, over the earth bounds a supernatural dog. So I love the way that she writes about these images too. I made myself an applique vest with that image on it, which I still love to wear. The image on the front is also from that book. I spent a lot of time in museums in the Mesopotamian pottery section, just drawing. And since I was a teenager, I have been making pisanki, Ukrainian eggs done with wax resist process. I can show you the kind of things I'm talking about. And I recognized these images in Gimbutas's work. So the same sorts of designs were on were on the pottery. And I've had this book since I was in my early 20s, Sainte-Marie, the icon of the universe. And these images are from the ancient Tropilian or Kukuteni culture, depends where the anthropologist is from, what it's called, but the Kukuteni imagery is in here too. So that might also explain my deep attraction to this book. But to get back to my story, so I spot this book behind the desk at the used bookstore and I ask to see it. It's $60. So what I do is I have the book set aside for me, I go home, and then on Thursday I go back with 15 books to trade in for it, hoping that it's going to be enough, because usually I get about $4 per book on average, and it worked out exactly. So I gave my stack of books. I was able to come home with this one. I'm just so happy. Very, very happy. Oh, yes, I feel my creative juices flowing already. And in that stack of books that I returned, there was a book that Sean the Book Maniac had given me, A Woman in the Dunes. And the fellow who was going through the stack, when he saw that book, he said, I'm buying this one. I really want to read this. So I felt like I wasn't the only one going away happy with that exchange. Anyway, let's get on to the real business of Friday Reads, which is what I've been reading since my last video, which was a recent reads that I did on Monday or Tuesday. 2 books I abandoned. One is Karen Armstrong's Sacred Nature, and I was listening to it in audio. It's read by the author, and I'm not sure what aspect of it wasn't working for me. Either that I felt like she was preaching to the converted, because I already recognized the importance of having a connection with nature, or the tone of her voice. She sounded almost scolding in the opening chapters. And anyway, for whatever reason, I decided it wasn't for me. And then I started listening to another audiobook, 4 Treasures of the Sky by Jenny Tinghui Zhang. And it's historical fiction that starts out in China in the 19th century, and orphan girl gets kidnapped, gets taken to San Francisco where she's forced to work in a brothel. And by that point, although I thought the writing was fine, I realized I was not in the mood to read about the experiences of a young woman forced to work in a brothel. And so I skipped ahead chapter by chapter in the audiobook until I discovered how she escaped, because I knew the whole long book was not going to be with her there, I knew that she would have other adventures. So yeah, so she escapes and ends up in a work crew in Ohio, I think, anyway, somewhere in the Midwest, and she gets raped there. And by this point, this is 5 hours into the audiobook, and I decided it just wasn't for me. So I switched to another audiobook, 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly. This is a classic of investigative journalism. I picked it up because Rebecca at Rebecca had recently talked about a graphic novel adaptation of the book. It was one of her top nonfiction of 2022. Anyway, that graphic novel edition wasn't available to me at the library, but I saw that we had the original text. So I listened to that and I thought it was pretty darn good. What happens is Elizabeth Cochrane, who goes by the pseudonym Nellie Bly, at 23 years old in 1887, takes on the project of getting herself committed to an insane asylum, and it was alarmingly easy for her to do that. And then while she was there, she took notes and then wrote an expose afterwards when she got out 10 days later. And as a result, there was a huge investigation and a whole bunch of money was added to the budget for psychiatric institutions in New York City, and important changes were made. So for just a taste of the style of her writing, the meals were practically inedible. Tin plate on which was a piece of boiled meat and a potato. It could not have been colder had it been cooked the week before, and it had no chance to make acquaintance with salt or pepper. There's a lot worse things that happen. The patients are beaten, insulted, choked, forced to take cold baths, the same water, one person after another, the same towels used on each person. Doesn't matter if their bodies are covered in sores or whatever. And the temperature is kept really cold, so the nurses are bundled up, but the patients aren't given sufficient clothing. The whole time Nellie Bly was in this institution, she said that she acted her regular self. She wasn't trying to act crazy when she was in there, and when she talked to the doctors, she tried to advocate for other patients, and she was always accused of making things up, and she always told them she was sane. It was a frightening example of how stuck women were once they were in there, and she said, as far as she could tell, many of the patients were actually sane like she was, but had been incarcerated because they were poor or unwanted by their husbands or family or whatever. And I guess this was the piece that really made a name for Nellie Bly. She went on to write a lot of other sensational things, but also to really advocate for working people, for the poor, for orphans. And I did read about her in Penelope Bagier's book, Brazen Women, back in March of 2022. So I will link that video below that I did especially for International Women's Day. Next up is a book I picked up on account of reading Awekotuku. You might remember that I talked about this in December on my channel. I can link that below. It was my friend Claire in Auckland who sent me this copy. When we discussed it, she said it reminded her of a much earlier book that was a retelling of the same myth, Awekotuku, the bird woman. It was one of the stories in this Ruahine. It's written by
Ngahuia te Awekotuku,
who is a lesbian activist from New Zealand who back in the 70s was barred from traveling to the United States because she is a lesbian activist. Anyway, the publisher of this is Huia, the same publisher that put out Awekotuku, which won a fiction award in New Zealand last year, by the way. So this one came out in 2003, and I read it then, and sure enough, it was still on my bookshelves, and I'm glad that I revisited it because there's still something fresh and exciting about myths retold with a lesbian feminist slant. And one of them in particular is a science fiction version. The story is about a woman who lives in the moon, and in the retelling, she's on a spaceship that eventually gets her back home. Yeah, so indigenous speculative fiction. I don't know how readily available this is, but it's certainly worth watching for if you're interested in mythic women. And speaking of indigenous science fiction, I also read Prism Stalker by Sloane Leong. This is a collection of 5 comics, so volume 1. I was immediately attracted to the psychedelic colors and the artwork. So the young woman at the center of this story is a member of a refugee community, and they're on a planetoid forced to work, and their connection to language and culture has been broken. So it's a kind of a familiar indigenous story. The author, by the way, is of mixed ancestry, including Native Hawaiian and Native American, and a bunch of other things as well. So this girl is recruited to a military academy where there are young people from kind of across the galaxy all working there, and they're all body shapes and types, not necessarily bipeds. And the themes in there of colonialism and being forced to engage in oppression are really intriguing to me. And like, our central character is queer as well, so many things to admire about this, but I don't know if future episodes have come out yet. Please let me know if you know anything about that. I did read an earlier book by Sloane Leong, or actually I'm not sure if it came before or after this, but it's a standalone. It's called A Map to the Sun, and it is got a contemporary setting about a group of women who play basketball together, and I loved it. I didn't like this one quite as well, but still 4 stars. Yeah. This is for mature readers, so for adults, basically. Next up, another graphic novel, science fiction, Little Monarchs by Jonathan Case. This one is aimed at young readers and certainly suitable for all ages from about 8 up to adults. It's post-apocalyptic. It starts out in the year 2101. So sometime in the past, there's been a sun shift, and as a result of this shift in the sun, almost all mammals on Earth have died off, including most of the humans, except for those who mostly exist underground whenever the sun is out. So we follow two intrepid scientists, Flora and this little girl, 10-year-old girl, Elvie, who are making their way down the west coast of the USA, and Flora is working on a vaccine to protect people from this sun sickness. She's got a medicine that will work for short periods of time, but what she's trying to invent is something that will be more longer lasting. So in addition to the adventure, and there are some pretty scary things that happen, there's also this great relationship between the two of them. Little Elvie, who is very resourceful and smart, is also irrepressibly full of fun, and she and Flora argue and fight, they apologize, they make up, and the emotional bond between them is just so evident in the pictures and in what they say to each other. I love this sunshiny watercolor art. It doesn't seem like a dystopia because of how happy the art seems, and it certainly does end on a hopeful note. And in between the action, there are these pages from Elvie's journal, her nature journal, that are full of all kinds of interesting facts. I don't even know where I heard about this book, but I am so glad because it is totally my jam. And next up is a picture book by the singer Buffy Sainte-Marie with illustrations by Julie Flett. So two powerhouse Cree creators. And look at these gorgeous illustrations. And words and music are included at the back. In a note to readers at the back, Buffy writes, "I wrote this song in a cabin in Alberta in the wintertime. For me, it was like taking photos with my heart of the things that I see on the reserve." This is an absolutely gorgeous picture book. I might include a clip at the end of this video to show you more of the insides if you're interested. Last up, another Indigenous story. This one is nonfiction. Valley of the Birdtail, subtitled An Indian Reserve, a White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. It is by Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson, whose name is also Amo Binashii in Swampy Cree. And they write about the town of Rossburn in northern Manitoba, which is right across the valley and the river from the Awekotuku Reserve. There was an amazing thing that happened with cooperation between the people of Rossburn and the people of Awekotuku that had to do with education of their students. And building up to that, there's so much important history in here that is written in a page-turning kind of style. The resolution at the end is so inspiring. I just want every Canadian to read this. So, so good. It's important, it's eye-opening, and heart-opening, and gave me a lot of hope for our future in this country and future relations between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Canadians. So that's it for me and my Friday Reads. Thank you so much for watching, as always. I love hearing from you in the comments, so please talk to me, say stuff. I did all this talking, now it's your turn. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.
Morning comes on shivering wings, and still this love goes on and on. Still this love goes on. In every dream I can smell the sweet grass burning. And in my heart I can hear the drum and hear the singers soaring and see the jingle dancers. And still this love goes on and on. Still this love goes on. Fancy dancer, come up north, see some friends of his. Fell in love